This is what I'm going to be talking about today, how the social justice movement harms higher education. So I'm going to be a little bit different from the speeches that you've already heard, the presentations you've already heard, because I'll be giving as much as I can in the time that I have some very specific examples. So, moving to my PowerPoint, I'm going to just share. Good? Okay. So I'm going to go through my notes and advance the slides as we go along. And again, if you could keep your questions to the end, that's probably going to be easiest for us to get through on time. All right, so up until the 1930s, there were Canadian universities that restricted or prevented Jews from being hired as professors. And it wasn't just Canada. Across the West, many universities made it clear that Jews with PhDs need not apply as professors. Now, history shows that these Jewish candidates often had significantly better research accomplishments and publication records than their competitors, but because of their race, they were prevented from even applying. So here's a question. Do you think that it is justice to disqualify someone from employment because of an immutable external characteristic? And what happens when the best person for the job, because of outright discriminatory criteria, is prevented from applying for that job? Well, I'll tell you what happens. The advancement of knowledge is held back. Discoveries aren't made. In general, the world suffers with problems for which solutions could have been found. But what about the opposite scenario? What happens when external characteristics are ignored and instead merit and competency alone decide who gets the job? Well, we know what happens there as well. Knowledge advances in leaps and bounds. Here's an astounding figure. In the last 100 years, we've seen Nobel Prizes given out to over 900 individuals. Approximately 20% of those Nobel Prize winners have been Jewish, even though Jews make up less than 0.2% of the world's population. Now, thank God we finally came to our senses and we abandoned our bigotry. Universities abandoned their bigotry and began letting those qualified for the job apply for the job. But I've got terrible news. In the past, we may have come to our senses, but in the last few years, we've again lost our minds. Discrimination in hiring is now back in full force at Canadian universities and some colleges. And there's a new target of the bigotry. Today, the hatred, or I would say the most hated candidate, is the straight white male. And this outright discrimination comes at a time when full professor positions in Canada are on the decline. So competition has never been greater. Give you an example. Since 2018, just the last 2 years, the public advertisements of at least 12 Canadian professor jobs have specifically said that straight white males could not apply. No matter how great your research accomplishments, no matter how many studies you've published, no matter how many awards you've won for terrific teaching, if you are straight white male, you cannot apply. Instead, and this is a quote from one of the actual job ads, here's who is allowed. The application process is restricted to members of the following designated groups: women, visible minorities, sexual minorities, persons with disabilities, and Indigenous people. And I'd note that in some of the ads, they actually leave out sexual minorities, meaning that even gay white men can't apply. And this discrimination is not happening just at what we'd call the insignificant centers of learning. It's happening at UBC, Western, Dalhousie, and other well-known universities. And here's the frightening reality. These are just the universities willing to publicly advertise their discrimination. So we don't know where this ideology has taken hold, and they're simply throwing the resumes, the CVs of straight white men into the garbage can. And of course, it's all done in the name of social justice. This is, again, the quote that I mentioned. This is an actual quote from one of the job ads. The application process is restricted to members of the following designated groups: women, visible minorities, sexual minorities, persons with disabilities, and Indigenous people. And of course, there is nothing wrong with these groups as candidates. What is wrong is that it is saying specifically, if you are a particular race, a particular gender, we will discriminate against you. It's madness to think that any good can ever come from discrimination. So discrimination for immutable characteristics like race and sex was deemed evil. Social justice promotes the insane idea that good can come from discrimination, and that simply is not the case. It took nearly 2,000 years for Western civilization to fully accept the Christian notion, and it did originate in Christianity, that all people are created in the image of God and therefore deserve equal treatment. That began within the Christian community, and then it slowly worked into the political landscape of Western nations. For an excellent treatment of how this progression was made, you can look at the work of Larry Seidentop. He wrote Inventing the Individual. He's a prof at Oxford. You can also see it in the scriptures, the New Testament scriptures themselves. As the Apostle Paul famously wrote in his letter to the Galatians, he said, "There's no longer to be divisions by race, like Jew and Gentile. There's no longer divisions by class, like slave and free. There's no longer divisions by sex, like man and woman, but everyone is equal." That is actually taken from one of his letters. Well, social justice ideology rejects that Christian and then what became a Western idea. The doctrine of social justice, it actually proudly screams, "Let the divisions begin again." Now, in the name of social justice, here's what we're seeing. Students at the University of Toronto, for example, have begun asking for their own graduation ceremony that keeps them separate from the white students. They're actually requesting segregation. What would Martin Luther King think? Another example, we have a black student just recently from February at the University of Virginia telling white students they had to leave the campus multicultural center because she felt there were just too many white people present. Can you imagine if that had been said by a white person about any other race? It would be disgusting, and it is disgusting when said about any race. Now, in the name of social justice, elite universities in the United States, schools like Harvard, are requiring Asian students to have higher averages than all other applicants just to get in. So it's not just white males who are suffering from discrimination, it's other people as well, like the Asian students at Harvard and other elite universities who are now seeing this discrimination applied. And what's Harvard's justification for this discrimination? They say, we must make more Asian applicants lose so that diversity can win. But clearly, all of us lose when hard work and sacrifice don't pay off. When the best and the brightest are denied the opportunity to reach their potential, we all suffer. Society suffers. Now, I told you my theme is how social justice negatively affects higher education. I've shown you one way that it does through this discrimination, but I'm going to give you another. Now, I want to use my own parable, one that reveals something about social justice and its negative effect on education. And while this parable does reveal a deeper truth, I want you to know it actually really happened. Like, I'm not just making this up. So as they say in Hollywood, this story is based on real events. And it all begins with a woman named Jane. Jane was doing a business degree at Ryerson University. So this woman from Ryerson University, she was in her 4th year. And to get her degree, she was required to take a non-business elective. Jane decided to take a course in introductory sociology. She found out early on from her instructor that the course would be taught through a social justice lens. Now, that's what the professor said, or from a social justice perspective. And it soon became clear to Jane what that meant. It meant that no matter the situation being studied, the professor would focus on areas in which minority groups experienced different outcomes than the majority. Then she would explain that the different outcomes, when they were negative, were caused by discrimination. And then she'd tell her students what kind of activism they needed to engage in to correct the situation. Over time, it became clear that the overarching theme of the course was that Canada is a terrible, discriminatory place. And various lectures claimed that in almost every interaction, whites oppressed non-whites, men oppress women, and heterosexuals oppress homosexuals. The claims were seldom, now get this, the claims were seldom accompanied by any statistical evidence. And why should they be, argued the professor. After all, she explained, statistical data and other objective methods were just tools to reinforce the tyranny of white, patriarchal, heteronormative society. And such methods needed to be rejected in favor of subjective, lived experience. So essentially, the entire scientific method was to be thrown out. So Jane learned in the class taught from this social justice perspective that the world was divided into villains and victims, the oppressors and the oppressed. Well, finally, the day arrived when the professor of the course wanted to see if her students were learning what she was teaching. She told the students that they had to write an essay related to something discussed previously in the course. At first, Jane was a bit stumped. The information that a professor had relayed in class didn't often match what she'd experienced in real life. Jane's parents had immigrated directly from Africa to Canada. And Canada had proved to be a welcoming country, full of opportunity for her mom and her dad, for her and her sister. So racial oppression was out. What else could she write about? Well, Jane was a woman, but in her life, she'd experienced men as friends and equals, offering support, not oppression. But she wanted to choose a topic that reflected her experience. So what could she do? In the end, after some prodding from her sister, Jane came up with an idea. She decided that she would write an essay on the gender wage gap between the average earnings of men and women. And the core of the gender wage gap argument is that rampant sexism in the workplace leads to women as a group making less than men. So sexism against women leads to them making less than men. But Jane wasn't arguing for it. She was going to prove that it was a myth. According to the instructions of the assignment, every student had to get their topic approved by the professor. Jane wanted to make sure that she could move ahead with her work, so in her email to her prof, she let her know that she intended to dig deep into the research. It wasn't going to be an opinion essay. It was going to be based on research. She told her that as a business student, she was familiar with all the top academic business journals, and she was going to use peer-reviewed data from those business journals. She was also going to use the latest government statistics to back up the claims in her paper. Now, up to now, I've been paraphrasing and slightly dramatizing the story, although the facts are true. Now I'm going to give you the actual quotes. Here are some of the things Jane's professor actually said in her reply email. She began, "Dear Jane, first off, your premise is wrong. The wage gap is very real. You need to look at feminist sources on this issue. Do not, with not in all caps, use business sources. They blame women. The reality is patriarchy. You need to do lots of research. Look at feminist sources on this issue." And then the prof concluded, "There is a ton of feminist research on this issue." Jane was also told in the assignment guidelines that reports and data that had been produced by provincial governments, the Government of Canada, or even Statistics Canada could not be used as scholarly sources because, and again, this is a quote from the professor, they reproduce mainstream stereotypes, assumptions, and misconceptions. So let's recap. What kind of sources could be used? Well, only sources that would not contradict the professor's claims. Only feminist sources were allowed to be used. So that's the end of my parable. Now it's time to explore what it teaches us. Specifically, what does that story from real life show us about social justice's negative effect on education? And I'm sure that you get the gist, but I'll summarize the moral of the story like this. If we were to examine the best case scenario, we would assume that to be of any worth, education must be a contest of ideas in the pursuit of truth. There needs to be solid evidence, But social justice corrupts education and stifles the pursuit of truth by not allowing opposing ideas to be spoken. And in addition to that, it makes claims in the absence of evidence. So up to this point, I've given an example of the way that social justice directly leads to censorship. I want to conclude with just an idea, and the idea revolves around the notion of causation and correlation. So that you could say that this is my second theme then, and we'll call it social justice harms education by making claims in the absence of evidence. So where does social justice make claims in the absence of evidence? It does so every time it claims that a difference in outcome between different groups of people is caused by bigotry and discrimination. So listen to that again. It says that if you see a difference, and the difference is negative between two groups, men and women, whites and blacks, if there's a difference and it's negative, the cause is bigotry and discrimination. And the way that devout followers of social justice perform this manipulation is that they convince people that correlation equals causation. For example, if there's a different outcome, as I said, between men and women get less of something that's desired, the social justice believers claim the difference is caused by sexism. But interesting, when women come out on top, they say it's due to their individual effort, or they just ignore it altogether. So what kind of things do they choose to ignore? Well, 60% of all university undergrads are women, and each year that percentage gets larger as the number of men decreases. More women graduate from medical school, and they get more PhDs than men. These are different outcomes, with men on the losing end. So I wonder, is this caused by systemic sexism against men in the university system? And of course, I don't think that's the case. Of course, I think there are other factors. But what about other outcomes? What about these other disparate outcomes outside the university setting? Well, 95% of teachers' college students in the elementary stream are female. Are men being targeted for exclusion in that program? 92% of nursing students are female. Is the nursing program anti-male and purposely keeping them out? And what about the social justice claims regarding race? They say if there's a different outcome between people of different races, the social justice believers claim the difference is caused by racism. Typically, they say that whites have extra advantage or privileges that Canadians of other races don't have. But to make that claim, the social justice believers have to ignore that in Canada, and indeed in the United States, in the United Kingdom, Asian Canadians have the highest educational achievement and highest salaries, even after one generation. So how does one visible minority community completely avoid this systemic racism that social justice believers say plagues our society? The simple answer is this: racism is not a factor, at least not systemic racism. Would I agree that there are racist people? There are fewer in Canada for sure than in the United States, but they are an extreme minority. And systemic racism certainly is not in existence here. The truth is, all the best empirical evidence shows it's other factors related to personal choices and not discrimination that's leading to these differences. And when we're not under the toxic influence of social justice manipulation, we can see that clearly enough for ourselves. In fact, it's time for us to open our eyes, because if we listen to the social justice believers, it's only going to be the blind leading the blind. Thank you.